Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Today we'll be talking about what it is to be with the Google search team here in India. I'm Lakshya Shivram Krishnan and I work with the Google Developer Relations team where I manage the Women Tech Makers program for India. I have two amazing engineers, Vivek and Ayushi, and I'll let them introduce themselves for us.
Hi, so I'm Vivek. I have been at Google for over 10 years, and in these 10 years, I have done lots of different products. I have worked on search, I have worked on news, I worked on YouTube, I've also worked on digitizing old newspapers, which is kind of this strange project. And I'm excited that finally I'm able to work on search with all my experience.
Thank you, Vivek. So I am Ayushi. I joined Google just around 7 months back, and I joined the Google search team in Bangalore. And yes, I was very excited, especially to be joining the search team here. And the best part is that I'm still excited every day when I come to work, and it's just so amazing the kind of impact that we get to create here with our projects, the kind of people that we get to work with. So yeah, it's been amazing.
Thank you. So let's dive right in. And can you talk to us about some of the interesting challenges that you worked on as a part of the Google search team?
Yeah, I got to recently work on this very interesting feature, which was about teaching people how to pronounce English words via Google search. So this was a very, very interesting experience, and unlike anything that I've done in my so many years at Google. And there were very interesting challenges. So for example, firstly, we wanted to bring a sequence of, we wanted for every word to be able to show a sequence of letters, right? So that people could read those and understand how to pronounce a word. Now this, it turns out, is an incredibly hard problem. There are so many accents, there are so many nuances of these accents, right? And there are Wikipedia pages on these things. And I got new respect for people, teachers of ESL, as I was working on this problem. Secondly, this answer actually shows up right at the top of Google search results. It has images, it has a playing audio, it has a bunch of things. So latency was a very big issue. So for example, we had to ensure that on all kinds of networks and all kinds of phones, this thing would actually work well, right? So we did a lot of latency tuning, which is also kind of a very interesting experience. And thirdly, about what queries do we want to show this for, right? So let's say some user comes to Google and types a query, how do I say tomato, right? And that's a query in which you would expect like a pronunciation answer. It'll say, okay, here is how you say it and all that. But how about how do I say sorry? Now, so that's an interesting query. That looks like the same kind of query, but clearly, it's quite different. So yeah, so those were some of the interesting challenges that we faced. It was a very, very interesting experience.
Wow. So I have just been here for 7 months, and I've been working on trying to understand queries in Google search. So a lot of people would think that, well, that's been going on in Google search for a long time, right? But as it turns out, the different ways in which different people interact with Google search varies from place to place, from person to person, and so on. So for example, I speak Hindi, I speak English. So even when I'm typing a query on Google search, I tend to create a mix of both. So I'll have a few Hindi words in between and so on. And in countries like India, especially where there are so many users who are multilingual, it becomes a very important way in which people interact with Google search. And it becomes important for us who are trying to build some features, as Vivek pointed out, to first understand what the user is trying to ask for and then try to satisfy the user. So yeah, that's been a very interesting problem for me to work on.
Nice, thank you. So you've been around for a while, Vivek, but Ayushi, you just joined us 7 months ago. So what is it that surprised you the most about the Google search team here in India?
Okay, so I think the one thing that I heard the most before joining Google is that the culture here is great. And there was so much hype about the kind of people, the kind of environment, and so on. And the interesting thing is that that was again the most surprising thing for me as well. Because even though I'd heard so much about it, it didn't do justice to the kind of culture that actually is here. So for example, I won't be able to do justice to it. But for example, just before coming to this live, we played TT with our whole team, about 7-8 games of TT. And we do this almost every day. After lunch, we just get together and play TT. And my manager, I think he joined Google some 10 years back and is a very senior engineer at this point. And when we play TT, it doesn't matter who is senior, who is junior, who has just started playing TT, who is an old player, and so on. What matters is that we all have fun, we all sometimes pull each other's legs, and so on. And the best part is that the same thing translates in the meeting room as well. So it doesn't matter if I am new to Google and there are people in the meeting room who are all like with a decade or over experience. What matters is that if I have a new idea, if I have something to say, I know that it'll be valued just as equally as anybody else. And that is a wonderful feeling to have, especially as a person who has just joined, right? So I think that's been very surprising and very amazing for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting to hear because I mean, I've been here for a long time. And when I joined Google, this office was about 30 people, right? And every meeting, everybody was invited. So there was really no meetings, team meetings at all because the entire group was invited, right? And it's great to hear that, you know, the same kind of thing is still there. We've grown significantly since then. One other thing that I kind of generally wanted to talk about was that there's a huge amount of, you know, bottom-up culture in some sense. There is, for example, if you ask Google about when does the sun rise tomorrow? Okay, this is a very, very simple question. It probably pops up in lots of people's minds. And it turns out that there was an engineer who decided that Google wasn't able to give a good answer to this. And he changed things, right? And it works today. So that's another kind of, you know, thing I feel like even at this scale, at this size, we're able to do with, you know, all of us. That's I think it's amazing.
Cool. So what do you think is the secret sauce that makes Google different from the other organizations?
Yeah, as our fearless leader would say, it's AI and machine learning, right? So, yeah, to be more serious, I think there are three things. Firstly, we are very fortunate to work in a space where we are consumers of our own technology. So, for example, everything that we build, we are also users of. So, it's very easy for us to get intuitions of what to build, what not to build, how to build something, right? Finally, secondly, it's also not so important to not really important to have very good intuitions because you can just test things. We have so many people who use our products, so we can just run A/B tests, and then that will give us data on whether, you know, what our intuitions was really being backed by data, right? And finally, yes, it is AI and ML, right? And it's also a lot of cloud infrastructure, which obviously we are kind of like the leaders of in the world. There's also a lot of great people, right? And at the size of Google, such a culture that kind of you can just talk across to lots of teams and collaborate with lots of people very, very easily. I think those are the three that I would pick.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, for me, in the time that I've been here, I've seen so many people just so excited about what they're working on. And they're excited about problem solving, they're excited about the users who will be using this product, and they're so excited about the kind of impact that their small things will create, right? And I see this percolating down to every small meeting, every small decision that's made here. And yes, I think that is definitely different from any other company. I would say that's the secret sauce.
Interesting. I've interacted with a lot of students and they're extremely interested in research. So what are the kind of opportunities that the Google search team has for them?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I think you know, researchers are in essence looking for very interesting problem statements. Now it turns out that, you know, because the space we operate in, we have a lot of these problem statements every day in all products. And so just to give you an example, you know, let's think about trying to find meanings of words. And let's say you're looking at a sentence and you would say, I don't know the meaning of this word, and you want to find it quickly. This is a very tricky problem, and it's actually a problem that is potentially at the cutting edge of research. For example, take the word L-I-V-E, right? So there is, it could mean live, like we all live and we're all living happily, right? It could also mean live, like the video that we're currently in, right? And so how do you distinguish between these two things? Now, and can you take the context around the sentence and kind of figure out that this is the right meaning of the sentence? Let's say you were given a full dictionary, can you figure out? Now, this is an interesting problem. This problem, if solved correctly, right, could actually lead to a research paper quite easily, right? So we have lots of problems of this kind, and the best thing is that we can take problems like this, and if they are solved correctly, we can quite easily turn them into useful things inside our product.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when I was in college, for example, I was very interested in natural language processing, and I was a little confused about whether going for research or coming here, so on. But the best part here is that here I am able to work on those hard problems, and then I'm able to also see the impact that my solutions create. So I think there are a lot of very good problems to solve, and there's also a lot of impact that can be created with them. Yeah.
Amazing. And can you talk to us about the structure of the Google search team here in India?
Yeah, so Google, as you know, is like a, it looks like a very simple product. It gives you, search results instantaneously for anything you type in. But behind it, obviously, there's a huge team and a huge set of groups that work, right? So, for example, there are people who work on how to match your query with a bunch of documents and find you the 10 best ones and that's basically ranking. There are also many different kinds of queries. So, for example, the query about when does the sun rise, or the name of what's when was Virat Kohli born, or like any of these things, right? They're a very different kind of query, and we're seeing many queries of this kind in names of movies and so on, right? And there's an organization that works on these kinds of queries, which is kind of quite different. There is people, of course, who work on infrastructure. They kind of build all of these things, and then this is how we are able to get you Google results at blink of an eye. And finally, there's, of course, you're going beyond search. We're going to assistant. Assistant is more conversational. It has elements of search inside it, but it can be personal. It's personal. It has context and things of that kind. So these are all the potentially different teams, right? We already have elements of many of these teams in Bangalore today, right? And we're looking to grow, and we'll build teams that mirror many of these teams as we grow, right? In terms of how like a typical engineer's life might look, right? I think Google likes very, very small teams, because that's kind of keeps people kind of working together cohesively without like. So I think I would expect to work in a small team of 5 or 10 engineers, and be working on a very small piece of the puzzle, right? But at the same time, there's obviously a huge number of ways in which these engineers can see beyond what they're doing. So, for example, engineers can travel, right? Visitors do come to our office frequently, right? And there's a lot of opportunities for people to interact, right? So that way, kind of, you get a good worldview while you're still working on a problem that's so impactful.
That's like, I mean, a lot of my friends were so jealous, because in the first 2 months that I joined Google, I got to go to 3 different countries outside India. And while this was a coincidence, I was just like, it happened that way. But yeah, that tells you how much you get to actually go out and interact with these engineers all over the world. So it's great.
Thank you. We've been keeping our eyes open on the live chat, and we'll be taking your questions right now with Vivek and Aishi answering a few of them. So can we start with the both of you telling us about how does a typical day for you at Google look like?
Okay.
You go first.
So the good thing is that the first thing that people talk about in Bangalore is the traffic, and I avoid all of that by living close by. So after coming in, the one thing to look forward to is like maybe answering all my emails for the day and so on, getting done with that. The interesting parts of the day are, as I mentioned before, playing TT with my team. I do a lot of Zumba whenever there is time in office. People would think that we don't work, right, if I keep answering this way. But yeah, and between those, and I think I have like about 4 meals a day, all of this in the office, because again, I live nearby and I'm lazy to cook. So yeah, in between all of that, I walk. That's it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's for me, it's a little bit different. I have a kid, and the kid goes to school at 7 in the morning. So in some sense, we have to be up at 6. But kind of, after sending this kid to school, we have a few hours to ourselves. I come into work around 10. And the first few hours, I kind of are a little bit more of coding time, or time in which I kind of think about, different kinds of things that we're doing in the team and so on. The afternoons are usually kind of, for me, are a lot of meetings and a lot of potentially one-on-one meetings with engineers about things that are going on, that product projects that we're working on. A lot of it is super technical, and we're talking about like small details. For example, we're trying to figure out how to evaluate something, or how to, for example, how to improve latency, like I was talking about, and so on. So things of this kind. Yeah. So there's also opportunities for lunch in the middle, TT after, chai at 4 o'clock,
Yeah.
accompanied by interesting snacks, right?
Yeah.
And all of that stuff before I get to head home in the evening. So yeah, interesting day, I think, always.
That sounds good. So do you consider search as a solved problem?
Yeah, I think it's so it's an interesting question. So the key thing to understand in all of this is that the world changes very, very fast, right? And as the world changes, right, so also do the needs of people who come to Google search. Now, it's hard to imagine, but even 7 or 8 years ago, the number of mobile phones in the world were not that many, and the number of mobile phones with 4G were like even fewer. Right now, you can just fish out your phone, and it feels, uncanny if you can't figure out whether how long will it take for me to reach home. Right. So I think search has kind of evolved with the times. There's a lot of new things that search is doing, and a lot of different challenges. So for example, I talked about this pronunciation answer, which is kind of a quick thing that people would do this on their phone quite easily. They would expect Google to kind of be able to give them this answer. So I think that makes things different.
Yeah. So I think one thing that has definitely changed is that for this live, my grandmother was very excited, which means that she spends a lot of time on her phone these days. And for most of the things that she wants to get to know, she goes to Google. Now she can speak only in certain languages. She wants to probably use voice instead of typing because it's easier for her. She maybe wants a few visual elements to help her, and so on. So obviously it's like changing every day, and there are a lot of different people who are coming on Google search, on mobile, and so on. So
Interesting. Thank you. Can you talk to us more about the Knowledge Graph team?
Yeah, the Knowledge Graph is a very interesting addition to search. As many people probably know, it was seeded by a company that we acquired called Freebase, and it was originally started because it was kind of understood that Google knows a lot about your queries, but doesn't know necessarily about things like common sense things that people know in this world, right? So that's what Knowledge Graph is here to do. And over time, the Knowledge Graph has become more and more kind of central to how Google works, because a lot of things that people are asking about are a mix of a normal query and something that is actually a real thing in the real world. Okay. So the Knowledge Graph team itself is a very, very big team. There's people who are kind of sort of getting and curating this graph. There are people who are serving this graph at like huge amount of scale to be able to kind of work with search and all that. There's also people who are trying to understand queries, and on the other side and say that, okay, this is query about this knowledge graph entity and so on, and then search takes care of all of that stuff. So yeah, that's kind of the rough breakdown of how the knowledge graph team works.
Thank you. The next question we have is for you to talk about a few projects for search as a part of the NBU initiative. For those who don't know, NBU is the Next Billion Users initiative. So either of you could take a stab at it.
Okay, so one thing that we realize, especially for the Next Billion Users, is that a lot of times, a lot of the content is not available, for example, in web pages. And people get a lot more information, say for a movie nowadays. If I want to get to know what the movie is doing and how the movie was, what I do is just go and scroll on the Google reviews. And there are so many people who are writing reviews. And then I can scroll down and kind of find people who I think, are writing reviews or are thinking in the similar way that I think. And according to that review, I can decide whether I want to watch a movie or not, and so on, right? So I think that this is one direction which Google Search in India is also pursuing, where we try to give content to the users generated by the users, right? So yeah.
There's also another project where we understand very well that for many kinds of many languages in India and many kinds of queries, there isn't enough content on the web, like and there are projects that are trying to kind of potentially address that in novel ways. So for example, at the bottom of search today, you can probably see, if you're on your mobile phone, if you type a query that you don't seem to like the results or get interesting results, you can actually ask a question, and that question will be sent to people who are creating content. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting way of kind of getting content in that kind of matters to people who are asking. So that's one of the
Interesting. And can you speak about the challenge of dealing with multiple languages in a country like India, and just run us to the technical stack for a problem like this?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting problem. So India has obviously like a gazillion languages, and people don't even like make our life easy by speaking in one of them, right? So they speak in all of them together, right? And some of them half in Hindi, half in English, and so on and so forth, right? So for example, imagine how you would do. Let's say you fished out your phone and you hit on Google Voice and as voice search, and you're talking to Google like this, and you're talking in multiple languages. Now, how will voice even determine, okay, what language you're speaking in? Okay, there's no clue. I mean, I can guess from maybe you are in Bangalore, so maybe you are speaking in Kannada. Wrong. Okay, maybe you're in, and so on and so forth. You get the drift. So, for example, one of the things that that Search did recently was to actually launch a multiple voice model that kind of in parallel kind of sort of will run the voice through multiple detectors to kind of understand which language you're speaking in. This still doesn't handle the problem of you speaking multiple languages at the same time, which also is like something that's super common. But I mean, this gives you kind of one of the ways in which we're trying to solve this problem.
Yeah, even in search queries, as I mentioned before, like there are so many queries. Like even when I type a query, I never realized it before I actually joined this team as to how difficult I make life for Google when I'm typing something which has a few Hindi words, then a few English words, then again a few Hindi words, then a few numbers and so on, and then a few names maybe. So yeah, it is especially again in a country like India, there's so many people who want to express themselves in certain ways, and it's again not just one language but 3 or 4 languages together. It's a very interesting problem.
Yeah. And what makes working in Google different from working with anywhere else in the world?
Okay, I think I answered this question in the culture point, but again, I think one thing is the people. It definitely comes down to the people, right? So when I interact with people here, there are so many people who have they have such amazing experience, like Vivek here. He has just so many interesting stories to tell us about. As he mentioned, like when he started here, there were just 30 people. There were just a few projects, and then there were so many other projects that he got to work during his time here, and all of those projects had some amazing interesting problems to solve. And just by listening to those stories and how people went on and actually solved those problems, it's just so cool. And even the people who are joining, like who are just say 1 or 2 years into the company, most of us are just so passionate about the things that we're working on just because the culture is such, right? So people, like even in our free time, for example, sometimes we'll just take a few problems and just sit and try to solve them. And what does is like it just creates this amazing culture of problem solving, and sometimes I get insights from that which I actually go back and use in my project, right? So that is something that's just amazing for me. Yeah,
I was sold it dosa for breakfast. I mean, nothing beats the having Indian food and chai at 4 o'clock and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I mean, it's also, I mean, comparatively, I mean, I feel it's a much more informal environment. Like I think Ayushi talks about, we are much more friendly. We are kind of sort of course, India is a very heterogeneous country, but still we are quite used to kind of each other in some sense, and then we continue that kind of atmosphere in the office. And then if you could live in India, right, and you could enjoy all the aspects of living in India, being close to your family, enjoying all the festivals and all of that stuff. In fact, some of those festivals are celebrated in the office, right? And working on all of this stuff with cool people, with great projects, awesome impact. Why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Vivek and Ayushi, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. You could check the description below for more additional resources, and make sure you subscribe to Life with Google. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.